Mr. Creeps here to give you another creepypasta. I hope you like it. If you do, hit that like and subscribe button. Enough of me talking though, let's get to the story. Last year I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in my local paper looking for imaginative people looking to make good money. And since it was the only ad that week that I was remotely qualified for, I gave them a call and we arranged an interview. They told me that all I'd have to do is stay in this room alone with sensors attached to my head to read my brain activity. And while I was there, I would visualize a double of myself. They called it my Tulpa. It seemed easy enough, and I agreed to do it as soon as they told me how much I would be paid. And the next day I began. They brought me into a simple room and gave me a bed. Then attached sensors to my head and hooked them into a little black box on the table beside me. They talked me through the process of visualizing my double again, and explained that if I got bored or restless, instead of moving around, I should visualize my double and moving around, or try to interact with him, and so on and so on. The idea was to keep up him with me the entire time I was in the room. I had trouble with it the first few days. It was more controlled than any sort of daydreaming I've done before. I imagined my double for a few minutes, then grow distracted. By the fourth day, I could manage to keep him present for an entire 6 hours. They told me that I was doing very well. The second week, they gave me a different room with wall-mounted speakers. They told me they wanted to see if I could keep the tulip with me in spite of distracting stimuli. The music was distorted, ugly, and unsettling, and it made the process a little more difficult, but I managed nonetheless. The next week, they played even more unsettling music, punctuating with shrieks, feedback loops, what sounded like an old-school modem dial-up, and a guttury voice speaking some foreign language. I just laughed it off. I was a pro by then. After about a month, I started getting bored. To liven things up, I started interacting with my doppelganger. We had conversations or played rock, paper, scissors, or I imagined him juggling or breakdancing or whatever caught my fancy. I asked the researchers if my foolishness would adversely affect the study, but they encouraged me to do so. So we played and communicated, and that was fun for a while, and it got a little strange though. I was telling him about my first date one day, and he corrected me. I said my date was wearing a yellow top, and he told me it was a green one. I thought about it for a second, then I realized he was right. It creeped me out, and after that shift that day, I talked to the researchers about it. Using your mind through form to access your subconscious, they explained. You knew on some level that you were wrong, and you subconsciously corrected yourself. What had been creepy was suddenly cool. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I found it was quite easy to do. I could make it quote whole pages of books I once read years before, or things that taught then immediately forgot in high school. It was awesome. It was around the time that I started calling up my doppelganger outside of the research center. Not often at first, but I was used to imagine him by now that it almost seemed odd not to see him. So whenever I was bored, I visualized my double. Eventually I started doing it almost all the time. It was amusing to take him along like an invisible friend. I imagined him when I was hanging out with friends or visiting my mom. I even brought him along on a date once. I didn't need to speak to him out loud, so I was able to carry out conversations and no one was the wiser. I knew it sounded strange, but it was fun. Not only was he walking responsibly of everything I knew and everything I had forgotten, he also seemed to more in touch with me than I did at times. He had an uncanny grasp for the mutual body language that I didn't even realize I was picking up on. For example, I thought the date that I brought him along on was going badly, but he pointed out that she was laughing a little too hard at my jokes and leaning towards me as I spoke, and a bunch of other sub-clues that I wasn't consciously picking up on. I listened, and let's just say that date went very well. By the time I'd been the research center for 4 months. He was with me constantly. The researchers approached me one day after my shift and asked if I'd stop visualizing him. I denied it, and they seemed pleased. I silently asked my double if he knew what prompted that, but he just shrugged it off. So did I. I withdrew a little from the world at that point. I was having trouble relating to people. It seemed to me that they were so confused and unsure of themselves, and I had manifest myself to confer with. I made socializing awkward. Nobody else seemed aware of the reasons behind their actions, why things made them mad or others made them laugh. They didn't know what moved them, but I did, or at least I could ask myself and get an answer. A friend confronted me one evening. He pounded on the door until I answered it. He came in fuming and swearing up a storm. "You haven't answered your call in fucking weeks, you dick," he yelled. "What's your fucking problem?" I was about to apologize to him and probably would have offered to hit the bars with him that night, but my tulip grows suddenly furious. "Hit him," he said. Before I was able to know what I was doing, I heard his nose break. He fell to the floor and came up swinging, and we beat each other up and down my apartment. I was more furious than I had ever been, and not merciful, knocking him to the ground, and gave him 2 savage kicks to the ribs, and then that was it. He fled, hunched over, sobbing. The police were by a few minutes later. I told them that he'd been an instigator, and since he wasn't around to refute me, they let me off with a warning. My tulip was grinning the entire time. We spent that night crowning about my victory and sneering about how badly I'd beaten up my friend. It wasn't until the next morning I was checking out my black eye and cut lip in the mirror that remembered what had set me off. My double was the one who grew furious, not me. I've been feeling guilty and a little ashamed, but he goaded me into a vicious fighter with a constant friend. He present, of course, and knew my thoughts. "You didn't need him anymore. You don't need anyone else," he told me, and I felt my skin crawl. I explained this to the researchers who employed me, but they just laughed it off. "You can't be scared of something you're imagining," one told me. My double stood beside him and nodded his head, then smirked at me. I tried to take their words to heart, but over the next few days I found myself growing more and more anxious about my tulip. He seemed to change. He looked taller, more menacing. His eyes twinkled with mischief, and I saw malice in his constant smile. No job was worth losing my mind over. I decided if he was out of control, I'd put him down. I was so used to him at this point of visualizing him, it was an automatic process. So I started trying to my damnedest to not visualize him. It took a few days, but I started to work somehow. I could get rid of him for hours at a time, but every time he came back, he seemed worse. His skin seemed ashen, his teeth more pointed, his hissing grubbers and threats and swore, and the distorted music I'd been listening for months had accompanied him everywhere, even when I was at home. I'd relax and sit up and no longer concentrate on seeing him, and there he would be, that howling noise with him. I still visited research center and spend my 6 hours there. I needed the money, and I thought they weren't aware that I was now actively not visualizing my tulip. I was wrong. After my shift one day, about 5.5 months into it, 2 impressive men grabbed me and restrained me, and someone in a lab coat jabbed me with a hypodermic needle into me. I woke up from my stupor back in the room, strapped to the bed, music blaring with my doppelganger standing over me, crackling. He hardly looked human anymore. His features were twisted, his eyes were sunken into the sockets and filmy over like corpses. He was much taller than me, but hunched over. His hands were twisted, and his fingernails were like talons. He was short and terrifying. I tried to will him away, but I just couldn't seem to concentrate. He giggled and tapped the IV in my arm. I thrashed and restrained as best as I could, but I hardly moved at all. "They're pumping you full of the good stuff, I think." How's the mind? All fuzzy? He leaned closer and closer. He spoke. I gagged. His breath smelled like spoiled meat. I tried to focus, but I couldn't banish him. The next few weeks were terrible. Every so often, someone in the doctor's coat would come in, inject me with something, or force feed me a pill. They kept me dizzy, unfocused, and sometimes left me hallucinating or delusional. My thought forms were still present, constantly mocking. He interacted with me, and perhaps caused my delusions. I hallucinated that my mother was there, scolding me, and then he cut her throat and her blood showered me. It was so real that I could taste it. The doctors never spoke to me. I begged at times, screamed, hurled invectives, demanding answers. They never spoke to me, though. They may have talked to my Tulpa, my personal monster. I'm not sure. I was so doped up and confused that I'd just been more delusional. But I remember them talking with him. I grew convinced that he was the real one, and I was the one thought form. He encouraged that line of thought at all times, mocking me at others. Another thing that I prayed was a delusion. He could touch me more than he could hurt me. He poked at and prodded me, and he felt I wasn't paying enough attention to him. Once he grabbed my testicles and squeezed them until I told him I loved him. Another time he slashed my forearm with one of his talons. I still have the scar. Most days I can convince myself that I injured myself and just hallucinated that he was responsible. Most days, then one day, while he was telling me a story about how he was going to gut everyone I loved, starting with my sister, he paused and curiously looked across his face. He reached out and touched my head, like a mother when I was feverish. He stayed still for a long moment and then smiled. All thoughts are creative, he told me, then walked out the door. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and passed out. I woke up unrestrained, shaking. I made my way to the door and found it was unlocked. I walked out to the empty hallway, and then I ran. I stumbled more than once, but I made it down the hall and out into the lot behind the building. I collapsed, weeping like a child. I knew I had to keep moving, but I couldn't manage it. I got home eventually. I don't remember how. I locked the door and shoved dressers against it. I took a long shower and slept for days and a half. Nobody came for me that in the night. Nobody came the next day or the one after that. It was over. I spent a week locked in my room, but it had felt like a century. I'd withdrawn so much from my life before that nobody had even noticed I was missing. The police didn't find anything. The research center was empty, and they searched. The paper trail fell apart. The names I'd given them were aliases. Even the money I received apparently untraceable. I recovered as much as one can. I don't leave the house much, and I have panic attacks when I do. I cry a lot. I don't sleep much, and my nightmares are terrible. It's over, I tell myself. I survived. I used the concentration those bastards taught me to convince myself it works sometimes. Not today, though. 3 days ago, I had a phone call from my mother. That had been a tragedy. My sister was the latest victim of a spree of killing, the police say. The perpetrator mugs his victims, then he guts them. The funeral that afternoon was a lovely service. The funeral can be as a funeral could be. I supposed I was a little distracted, though. All I could hear was the music coming from some distant, distraught, unsettling stuff that sounds like feedback and shrieking in a modern dial-up. I hear it still, a little louder now. Okay, that's all for this creepypasta. If you guys like, please hit that like and subscribe. I know the videos are weak right now, but I will be getting better within a few weeks. I'm getting everything situated now, and thanks for your support.